MP, you were pointing out to them there's actually some evidence the other way, that people cope perfectly well with lump sum payments.
I think there's a reasonable debate about that amongst people. In the end, I'm not sure it was ever whether it was possible or not for universal credit. I don't know. It might have been, but it was also we did do the 6 months. I think that's fine. For working tax credits, it had to be done in that way because the system is not able to do 6 months worth of payments. So we did it that way for working tax credits. It was an operationally driven decision rather than a policy decision. And if we did have the choice in universal credit, which I can't remember, we clearly decided to do it 6 months. And so that was, that's where we settled. As I said, I think it was entirely reasonable given everything else we were doing. And then, as we discussed earlier, what happened at the end of that was a permanent change to the universal credit system, which made it more generous as people moved into employment and worked, and essentially reduced the tax rate on them for working more.
Can I just pick up the point about lump sum payments in the context of legacy benefits? Accepting what you've said about, for operational reasons, you just couldn't deliver the uplift to legacy benefits. We now moved on quite a long time in the pandemic by the time of the extension. Had other work been done to see whether it would be, or an uplift to legacy benefits would be deliverable, payable by lump sum, if the policy objective had shifted, so that you could do something about that?
I can't recall. I remember early in the pandemic, it was certainly the case, and I think you've had evidence on this point, that it simply wasn't possible to do one-off payments for legacy benefits. I think the quote in the evidence is, that they'd never tested the emergency payments system at that scale, and that they would need at least 6 months to go through all of that. And I don't recall, when that work started. Given all the other demands on DWP's time, I'm not sure where that was. Thankfully, it was in place by the time of spring 2022, when we were responding to the energy bill shock, and we were able to use that new emergency payment system that had at that point been improved, or whatever it was that needed to happen to it, so we could use it to deliver effective lump sum payments. So again, in terms of the future, that has now been done, but I think legacy payments in the future won't be an issue. So it's,
because everyone will be on universal
credit anyway. So, but in any case, it had been done by spring 2022, which was good because we used it to respond to the energy shock.
Yeah. I'm sorry to get into what you might consider to be the weeds of details at 4:20, but just on when the decision to uplift was actually made, I just wonder if you can help us with this. And I'll give, there seem to be a few meetings, key meetings, in February of 2021. There was one on the 4th of February where the Secretary of State, Prime Minister and yourself had a trilateral. You had a bilateral meeting with the Prime Minister on the 8th of February where we know that universal credit was discussed. And you say in your statement you agreed to proceed on the 17th of February, 2021. And then there's a further trilateral meeting on the 26th of February. Can you help us at all with, your statement says 17th of February you agreed to proceed. Was it likely at the bilateral with the Prime Minister on the 8th of February, do you think, or was it a sort of continuing dialogue?
I honestly can't remember, but the budget was on the 3rd of March, and it was announced at the budget, and this is something that everyone is a bit more intimately familiar with OBR processes now, but that was something, it's the kind of thing that you would need to have communicated to the OBR, some period of time before the 3rd of March, maybe. And I tended not to do things last minute, so that I would have imagined would have been towards the end of Feb, maybe the 20th or something. So that feels about right to me, but I can't honestly remember beyond what I put in my statement as to as to where it was. But look, the Prime Minister was intimately involved in all of this, and would have signed off on the final decisions, as he would because of all the budget decisions. He would go through with me and sign off on them, and this was something that he'd had the meetings with Therese and me on, and ultimately took the final decision.
In terms of then the uplift ending, and again, it wasn't that a decision was taken to end it, it was just that it had been extended, and so it then came to its end, and that's probably the right way of looking at it.
Yes.
It's not a new decision not to end it. But looking back, and you having been very clear about what your objectives were and why you were doing this, and accepting that the DWP, in terms of extension, were pushing to try and land it permanently, do you think that public communication could have been clearer, should have been clearer, that from the very outset, don't get used to this, putting it bluntly, this is a temporary measure, that's all it's ever going to be?
I can't recall each individual instance that I was asked. I can't imagine that I was ambiguous on that point. And again, it's the same as all of the interventions. We'll go over the others tomorrow, but all the ones we've been through today all had and most of it was all announced at the spring budget, in that 3rd of March, where there was roadmaps for CGRS, for SAYs, business grants, etc., universal credit, working tax credit, all of that was announced. Here's the plan, here's the exit roadmap from the pandemic, here's how the economic support is going to taper off over the next 6 months. Look, there's always people who would want to create and lobby and create news and talk to people to try and get energy around the idea it should be extended. Of course, that's going to happen. But I guess the person who's doing that job, whether it was me then or someone in the future, they can't stop people from agitating or lobbying for it to be made permanent and suggesting there are reasons it should be. That's always going to happen. And I would have been consistent, I would imagine, throughout that, we've set out a set of taperings or finality to these schemes, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah. We understand that the DWP itself didn't do any monitoring or evaluation of the uplift in terms of that very narrow intended target group. I accept the wider point you've made about, if you like, the unintended benefits to everybody who received it in terms of poverty and living standards and so on. But in terms of its actual economic objective of cushioning the blow of those who lost their jobs or lost income, are you aware that whether the Treasury did any evaluation or not? And if not, isn't that important if you're spending money in that way to evaluate it?
Yes. I mean, we do know a range of things, and I think it's worth, just in the time we have, because this was something that, as I said at the beginning, was an objective of mine to support the most vulnerable, and I'm proud of what the government did and everyone who worked on this achieved. And like everything, nothing's perfect. But I think you've had evidence from lots of people, including the expert witnesses, who have been clear that what we did made a considerable difference to those low-income households. So much so that according to Dr. Brewer, deprivation and poverty didn't actually seem to increase during this period, which is surprising given the economic turmoil, and actually the official data shows that the proportion of households living in relative poverty actually fell from 22% to 20% during this period of time. The number of children in poverty fell, according to the Child Poverty Action Group, and some of the academic research that has been done by Blundell and others showed that income inequality fell during the pandemic. And then DWP do a survey, the HBAI survey, the Households Below Average Income survey, and we have some data from that which shows that the proportion of people facing food insecurity was lower in this pandemic year than it was the year before. Disposable incomes of the poorest fifth were higher, and actually material deprivation, because you've talked about costs previously as well, were lower. So even if there wasn't a formal DWP evaluation done, which obviously question for them, and maybe it can be done. There's an enormous amount of official data, academic research, survey data, and the Treasury published distribution analysis at all the events showing all these things that I've described, demonstrating that in aggregate, the policy objective supporting the most vulnerable people in society, by and large, did a good job of delivering on that, and all the data that I've just been through would demonstrate that. And again, of